that he could have been compromised and was eventually killed leads me to believe that he was the main person that time had expired on.
He says Ismail Haniyeh was standing in the way of a ceasefire, and everyone, including Iran, stands to benefit from his assassination, as he's replaced by someone who supports Israel and has previously spoken out about radical Islam.
So this person being in that position now, a new blood coming in, is probably going to set the stage a little bit better for Americans, Israelis, even the Iranians, to be able to allow the hostage negotiations to take place. So it happened. It was a good strike. And everybody stands to profit, to include the new president of Iran, who is more of a moderate and is willing to work with Western nations to bring Iran into the fold of being at the table again with the Western nations rather than where it is today.
This has been Matt Boylands with your TNT News Brief. I'll be back with more at the top of the next hour.
Critically analyzing global affairs. The Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, where we always pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial news issues of our time. Our mission is not just to shine a light, but to ensure that we have our unwavering quest to uncover the truth. It's vital that we don't just ask the questions, but question those answers. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into false flags. What do they mean? And the reality about how they're being used as an excuse for war. To help me do that, I'm delighted to be joined by the two regulars now on the Muckrakers, the wonderful Martin J. and Dr. George Szamuely. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Good to be with you, Andrew.
I will tell everybody, because it's always good to plug the other brilliant work that they do. Martin is an award-winning journalist and editor of Maghrebi.org, whose in circulation has increased massively since he's been doing the Muckrakers. He also has Levantis.me, which is glorious. His career spans over 30 years, but his highlight of his career has been with Andrew Eborn on the Muckrakers, and well done for that. He loves to say, and I will remind people, he's been fired by absolutely everybody, which is why we ended up with him, but we're very pleased to have him. CNN called him a good journalist, but a pain in the butt is what they said. And we're finding that more and more. And hopefully he's going to be joined by his wild animal Max at some stage. And very randy, we found out last time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The serious side and the intellectual amongst us, Dr. George Szamuely is a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute in London. He's written innumerable publications, and I would thoroughly recommend his book, Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia, and the usual commission, George, yeah?
Of course. Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. So I want to start off with talking about these the hostage, well, not the hostage releases. The Russian Federal Security Service officially announced that 8 Russian citizens have returned to their homeland following a prisoner exchange between Moscow and the West in Ankara on Thursday. This is part of a prisoner exchange where Moscow has released 16 foreign nationals in what has been described as the biggest prisoner exchange since the Cold War. Is this a welcome sign of diplomacy between the the West and Russia? Let's start with you, Martin.
I think we can say that it's a step in the right direction. Because of the Ukraine war, because of a number of agreements that the Russians had with America, test ban treaties, for example, exchange of information on weapons. All of these agreements have been sort of slowly unwritten and unwound. Of course, relations with Russia have been at an all-time low. And I think we're in a period now where a lot of people around the world, and I think the Russians included, are basically waiting for the US elections to produce a Trump victory. And this has created a certain impasse, I would say, a certain pause for many geopolitical ideas to come forth. And I think the idea that this prisoner exchange, hostage exchange happening, and the Wall Street Journal journalists being returned, I think is also very, very encouraging. So I think we can be cautiously optimistic. I think this was a good move by both sides, but in particular, Putin, I think it's a very smart move at this right moment. The time was right, and we can be relatively positive, I would say.
George?
Well, it's very hard to say. I mean, obviously, it's there's a humanitarian aspect to it. In the case of the most prominent of the Americans, Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, and of course Paul Whelan, who's been now in prison for 5 years. So there's a humanitarian aspect that they're released. Whether it portends anything more is unknowable at this stage, because let's remember, during the Cold War, there were regular exchanges of prisoners, and particularly of spies. I mean, the most famous one, of course, took place in 1962 between U-2 pilot Gary Powers, who had been shot down because he was spying on the Soviet Union, and he was exchanged for Rudolf Abel, and that set the pattern of regular spy exchanges. So in the UK, you had the Portland spy ring. A number of figures there had been imprisoned, including the man known as Gordon Lonsdale. The Russians know him as Konon Molody. And there was a lot of negotiations involved in releasing them. And there was an exchange eventually for a British lecturer, Gerald Brooke, that took place in the late 1960s. But none of those events led to any significant improvement in relations between the West and the Soviet Union. One should, I think, also say, by the by, is the way the media cover this. They invariably assume that, of course, Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan were wrongfully imprisoned, and they may have been. However, we can't really make that assumption. I mean, we know Gershkovich was a fluent Russian speaker, very anti-Russian. He grew up in a household. These were Jews who had left the Soviet Union. He was born in New Jersey. His political biases were obvious from the reports that he had filed for the Wall Street Journal. And then he went to this essentially military-industrial town, Yekaterinburg, where, I mean, all they do there is make missiles and tanks. And he started, asking locals all sorts of questions about production lines and, how many tanks are you producing? What's the tank inventory, the missile inventory? Well, you don't go around doing that kind of thing, asking those questions in the middle of a war and expect the government to treat you particularly favorably. Now, was he doing it at the behest of foreign intelligence services? Maybe. We can't rule this out. Were the editors who sent him on this assignment, were they cooperating with foreign intelligence services? Maybe. You can't rule it out. But it's just interesting how it's assumed. Well, of course, he was just a bona fide reporter. Well, how would Americans respond to a Russian reporter poking around in a military-industrial facility in the United States, asking all sorts of questions from a fluent English speaker, moreover? I don't think the United States would look upon this particularly favorably. But to go back to your original question, we don't know. We can ask you, it's possible that Biden, on the way out the door, wants to settle all kinds of outstanding issues, including the Ukraine war. I wouldn't bet on it. I think that's unlikely, but it's not impossible that he's got 6 months to go and he just wants to settle everything. He's not going to suffer too many adverse consequences as the man who betrayed Ukraine, the man who lost Ukraine, in the way that Harris would if she were president, and in the way Trump would if he were president.
Yeah, that's some excellent points, as always. I mean, Biden, basically, he thanked his allies who said it was the toughest call to release the prisoners. And basically, there were 24 detainees from 7 countries who were released. 10 people, including 2 minors, were relocated to Russia. It's taken about 18 months in the making. It's believed to have hinged on Moscow's demand for the return of the hitman, Vadim Krasikov, who was serving a life sentence in Germany. A very complex deal, which involved long, torturous negotiations and clandestine meetings. You have to sort of ask, however, now that Putin has done this, will he be saying, well, this works, arresting foreign citizens, putting them in jail, keeping them for barter? That's a good way to exert pressure on an enemy. What's your take on that, Martin?
It's the lowest common denominator, unfortunately, when relations are so bad. I mean, Western press tends to be very scornful of the Iranians doing this practice all the time, of just habitually arresting foreigners and keeping them as a sort of a collateral for negotiations for their own benefit. But when there's no relations, when relations are so bad, what can you expect? And unfortunately, this is an indication of the relations between West and Russia hitting an all-time low now, which we hope can't last forever. I mean, I think George is probably right. I think Biden does want to clean out his backyard. I would disagree with him on the issue of Ukraine. I would have a wager. I would wager a crate of Guinness, Andrew, that
another one.
Biden will try and wrap up Ukraine for the simple reason that he is vain and he will not want his legacy being tarnished by a Trump administration, which will open up all sorts of investigations and cans of worms. I mean, Trump has made calls to Zelensky. There seems to be a comfort there, a certain proximity which works between the two of them. And who knows what the terms of a deal will be. Maybe in the small print of a peace deal, Trump will say, oh, and by the way, I want a full investigation on everything that Biden was involved in Ukraine, and Zelensky won't have anything to do with it. So maybe this is I'm speculating, but maybe this is on Biden's mind. He's thinking of clearing out everything and leaving on a relatively good note.
Oh, I have no doubt at all that's exactly what he wants to try and do. He's thinking about his legacy. The threat of basically having Amendment 25 to drive him out was undoubtedly what caused him to step aside and let Kamala, as her name is, sort of step into the running. It was interesting going to many different studios. They all handed out these badges and what it means for journalists. I stand with Evan. There we go. That's what they do on that sort of basis. And this is the real thing, isn't it? What does it mean, finally, before the break, for journalists now? What's your take on that, George?
Well, of course, journalists are vulnerable. I mean, when we've seen what happens in the Middle East and in Ukraine. I mean, it's worse than there are worse things than getting kidnapped and held for barter. You could get killed. So it's a rough life if you're a serious journalist. You're in very dangerous zones. Now, the issue of the abductions and then the use of people for barter, I think that practice will continue. You obviously have adversaries, and when one adversary power arrests and puts on trial the citizen of the adversary, then the adversary will retaliate. Now, in the case of Vadim Krasikov, now whether he was acting at the behest of the FSB or not, we don't know. He may have just been a freelance assassin, so agitated by this fact, by this Chechen terrorist living a good life in Germany, and that he had killed so many Russians, that he took it upon himself to assassinate this Chechen. The Russians felt right away that this is a good, patriotic Russian citizen who was carrying out his patriotic duty to liquidate a terrorist. And almost from the beginning, when when the Germans arrested him, imprisoned him, I don't know, it was I think life imprisonment, that the Russians were determined to get him out, because essentially the Germans were punishing a good Russian noble patriot who wanted to avenge the deaths of fellow Russians. So yeah, there was obviously an incentive for the Russians to seize people and use them as part of the exchange to get Krasikov out. But incidentally, in the other cases of the Russians who were handed back to Russia, the case against them seemed awfully thin. I mean, if you look at these reports, they look to me like they were entirely cooked up in this whole NATO war, Cold War hysteria, when there was really no evidence at all against them. They were essentially kind of, the Poles arrested a Russian journalist and claimed, oh yeah, he's of course a spy, but they never presented any evidence to show that he was actually a spy. Same with this couple in Slovenia that was released. No evidence was presented against them, and it's very convenient that when they finally found them guilty and sentenced them to 19 months in prison, it was 19 months as time served. In other words, since they had been held in custody for 19 months, so very conveniently they said time served, so you can go. So, and again, when you look at some of these stories, you find Bellingcat. Bellingcat always seems to be at the center of all these stories. So now Bellingcat is entirely just a front for the Western intelligence services. And strangely enough, they're the ones providing evidence against all these Russians who have been arrested, in various parts of Europe. It's that we should not just simply assume, oh, well, we've got these were good guys who were arrested by the Russians, whereas the Russians that we released were bad guys. Frankly, the Western powers have not made much of a case against many of these Russians.
Yeah, so some excellent points as always. Well, we're going to be looking at our main topic about false flags and how that's used as an excuse for war straight after these messages.
While serving in Vietnam, a grenade took my ability to see. Today, I'm a sculptor, creating new visions. Now, my fingers are my eyes. As a veteran, I know the challenges of life can be great. In my art, turning a lump of clay into something beautiful, that means a lot to me. Life is like that. We each must use what we can to make things better.
DAV helps veterans like Michael get the benefits they've earned. They help more than 1 million veterans every year in life-changing ways.
Now, I show others how they can create something with their own hands. With support from DAV, more veterans can shape their lives into a thing of beauty. My victory is bringing beauty into the world.
Michael Naranjo, may your victories inspire many more. Support more victories for veterans. Go to DAV.org.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702. Or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
You're listening to the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, and also Dr. George Szamuely and Martin Jay. And we're going to be looking at false flags. Well, throughout history, some of the most pivotal moments have been shrouded in deception. Governments and militaries have often resorted to a sinister tactic known as the false flag. Well, what's that? It's basically a calculated political or military action designed to deceive. And what happens is by staging or simulating attacks on their own side, nations can create a convenient scapegoat justifying their aggressive moves. Now, the term was first used, actually, been doing a bit of research on this, in the 16th century to describe how pirates would fly the flag of a friendly nation to deceive merchant ships into allowing them to draw near. And false flag histories have basically had a long and ignoble history. And you think it might just all be made up? Well, there's a declassified 1962 document which reveals what's called Operation Northwards. And that was a chilling plan which was considered by the Kennedy administration. And basically this plan proposed fabricating terror attacks, including bombings and hijackings in American cities like Miami and Washington, D.C., to justify an invasion of Cuba. The operation, which involved killing innocent people and planting false evidence, was ultimately vetoed by President Kennedy, who released the documents to the public. But it does show that they are there. George, introduce me to this. What are your takes on false flags?
Well, of course, there's always a need for powers to provide a pretext for going to war, and therefore, when there's it's lacking, then you have to manufacture an incident. So let's take an example of the German attack on Poland on September the 1st, 1939. Well, Germany, despite all the belligerent talk of Hitler against the Poles, he used all the Poles were mistreating the Germans, the Poles were mistreating the Russians, and so on. He still didn't really have a pretext. He wanted this war, but he needed a pretext, so he had to manufacture one. He had to manufacture a supposed Polish attack, a Polish incursion across the German border that provided him with the pretext to, it's a retaliation. And that's really the point. Now, you talk about this Operation Northwards. Well, the reason why these Joint Chiefs were working on trying to manufacture all sorts of terrorist incidents that could then be attributed to Cuba was that they didn't really have any pretext. I mean, the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, they had the pretext there, not a very plausible, but that these were Cubans who were really, really very, very upset about the communists coming to power in Cuba. And so they planned this invasion to take Cuba back from the communists. But of course, it ended in debacle. But at least I had this was the American pretext. Well, we didn't have anything to do with it, but we just had these Cubans with this very zealous anti-communist. But after that failure, they had to come up with something new to knock over Castro. So they came up with this plan. Well, we'll stage these terrorist incidents. We'll stage attacks against American targets, and then that would provide a pretext for the U.S. invasion. Let's keep in mind the deal that was struck following the Cuban Missile Crisis involved the Americans pledging not to attempt to invade Cuba again. So the issue that somehow Kennedy vetoed this or anything, well, that was the deal. I mean, with Khrushchev, removing the missiles from Cuba, America removes the missiles from Turkey and Italy, and a part of the deal was no more attempts at invasion of Cuba. So there wasn't really some noble thing that Kennedy, this is shocking, we can't really do this. No, this was part of the deal with Khrushchev.
Martin?
Yeah, it's very much about public opinion. And George is right to use the word pretext. And not always we have a pretext to go to war. The Americans have proved that they have a long history of false flags, as that report to you allude to showed. And I'm quite happy to deflect blame to whoever was conveniently there. If we remember in 1964, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin, whereby the Americans claimed that they'd been under attack by North Vietnamese Navy, torpedo attack. It turned out to be completely fake, totally fabricated, because LBJ at the time wanted a context, and he didn't have the support of the people. He couldn't explain it to the people why he wanted to get into North Vietnam, why he wanted to. The argument at the time was that we can't allow rogue states in the region to become an example for communism, because it will spread, and so we need to nip it in the bud. And that was the ideology at the time. But it was a lie. It was no question about it. It was a lie. And Americans seem to be very susceptible to this more than Europeans. I've noticed Americans tend to be more patriotic and more naive, I found. I recently had a dinner party here in Marrakesh with a group of American journalists, but veteran American journalists, all in their 60s, from all the big titles. I won't name them. And they shocked me because they thought my ideas about 9/11 were quite hysterical and conspiracy theory, and because they found it so very, very hard to conceive the idea that 9/11 could have been an inside job, simply because their naive and patriotic ideology just clashed with the idea that that was something that other countries did around the world, that not America couldn't do that. But if we take false flag attacks, false flag attacks are becoming increasingly important because we tend to, in the West, start wars, but it's always becoming harder and harder for our leaders to justify why we continue in such wars. And that's the case for Ukraine, definitely. Most people, rightly or wrongly, and I would argue wrongly, believed that we needed to go to war with Russia because of the so-called invasion. But they didn't want to look at the history. They didn't want to look at the nuance of it. They didn't want to look at the 2004, 2014 elections, where we essentially installed our own Western puppet and cranked up the atmosphere by talking about NATO expansion, EU membership, and so forth. So when we look at Ukraine now, there is a very strong impetus, I say. There is a very much a reason for the West, for the Ukrainians, and for the West to create more false flag attacks. There have been a number over the last few months. I was very suspicious, very skeptical of just a couple of weeks ago, we had the NATO celebrations, the NATO birthday in Washington. And just 2 days before it, there was a massive attack by Russia on Kiev, you might remember. And one of the locations that was bombed was a children's hospital. And I remember thinking to myself, why would Russia do that? That can only create bad publicity, bad image around the world. Western journalists, of course, seized that. And then I asked myself, maybe the Russians did attack. Maybe they had a blitz of several locations, but the Ukrainians took advantage of that to actually bomb their own hospital, their own kids' hospital themselves. I know, completely far-fetched, you might say, but we have to ask that question. We have to, because there is a lot of talk now on both sides of false flag attacks. And for a long time, there has been a claim by Russia that the Ukrainians have been trying to carry out false flag attacks on a nuclear power station, which is being controlled by Russia. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the name of it. George will know it. And I think false flag attacks in Ukraine are going to be inevitable in the coming months, absolutely inevitable, and we should expect them. And I also think that when we talk about false flag attacks, it's impossible not to talk about October the 7th, which I've always believed from the very beginning. I've never swallowed completely hook, line, and sinker that Netanyahu knew nothing about it at all. I've never believed that. I've always believed that he probably knew that it was coming. But I go further in my articles, which people can read on Patreon. I've said in my own opinion pieces that I believe that it was orchestrated by the Israelis. I think the Israelis pushed Hamas more and more and more, knowing there would be a breaking point, and they were ready for the breaking point. And everything that happened on that day and consequent to that day, I think the Israelis are completely in control of and had a premeditated plan installed. And also, we can't really talk about false flag attacks without talking about 9/11, because 9/11 for me was probably one of the greatest false flag attacks we've really had in American history. I mean, nothing really compares to it. And, the extraordinary approach from Western media towards 9/11 should make a lot of Americans very, very suspicious. But, to swallow the narrative completely that we're dished out, is very hard for me. I think most of what we're told about 9/11 isn't true. And even how the buildings came down, even the jets themselves, I mean, there are now pretty strong evidence to show that those jets had some sort of attachment on their undercarriage. We've seen the video footage, the fact that the attacks were carried out on the same day that the Pentagon had war games where they simulated planes flying into buildings. And so the F-16s that would normally be scrambled to intercept those four planes didn't intercept them at all, not even 5 minutes, not even 10 minutes. Normally it was just a matter of minutes before they would have been engaged. There was confusion all over. None of the emergency services or military knew what they were doing because no one would work out what was real, what was a drill. The list, Andrew, just goes on and on and on. And even the forensic stuff, how those buildings came down. I can't be the only skeptical Western journalist who has looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of testimonials by architects who have experienced and controlled explosions and who said there's only one way those buildings could come down. You can't heat cast iron girders up to you need to heat them up to 2,000 degrees before they melt. And they were nowhere near that. They were at 700, 800 degrees, and the actual way that those buildings came down, and even Building 7, which wasn't even touched by it, it was all very, very suspicious. But a false flag attack, which benefited who? I mean, this is what we should be asking. You like to talk about asking the tough questions. Well, who benefited from 9/11? I mean, George Bush Jr. certainly benefited from 9/11. It was his wish to move into Iraq and into Afghanistan. It was the wish of his father as well. And the people he had around him, like Cheney and others from those neocons who had worked for his father, they all wanted to get into Iraq and Afghanistan. And they also wanted a second term for him. But I think if you ask the more pressing, salient question, who benefited in the region, in the Middle East, we can't look at that false flag attack without looking at the Israeli dimension to it. Israel certainly benefited from it. The Israelis, for a long, long time, had been very concerned that the American public were actually taking their eye off the ball and no longer being so concerned about the so-called Muslim extremist threat in the Middle East, and in particular, Hamas or Fatah in relation to what was going on in Israel. And so to stir up this massive amount of anti-Muslim hatred at that particular time, you are going to be called a conspiracy theorist if you point the finger at Israel, but I don't think we can dismiss Israel. We have to look at Israel as one of the suspects. So, false flag attack, which is probably going to go down in history as something completely unprecedented and one that has not even been resolved to this day. And, I think perhaps people have talked about Lockerbie in this regard. I don't think Lockerbie is a false flag attack, but it's something that people may well look at into a similar vein. We may well look at that on other shows, but 9/11 for me and what's going on in Ukraine, and to summarize what's happening now in October, from October the 7th in Israel and the ethnic cleansing, these are all false flag attacks, which journalists just aren't uncovering. They just aren't probing. And I think that's given confidence to the people who carry out those attacks. They can just say, well, look at media. We've got media in our pocket. What's our next false flag attack? So I'm expecting, and I've written it in my opinion pieces, which people can read on Patreon. I've predicted that in Netanyahu's case in Israel, the options for him are running out. His only option now is a false flag attack. So remember, you heard it here on Muckrakers.
And I think, and we often make the point that here on Muckrakers, we absolutely will ask the questions that others won't ask. And the reason we want to put it into historical context is a lot of people say, well, of course people don't bomb their own people or attack their own people, until you turn around and say, well, there's been a number of examples. I mean, I want to just get your take on this, George, about the Reichstag fire, which was an arson attack on the Reichstag building, home of the German parliament, on Monday, the 27th of February, 1933. It's precisely 4 4 weeks before Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. What do you know about the sort of evidence surrounding whether that was a false flag operation?
Well, most historians, I think, now accept that this was this crazy Dutchman, van der Lubbe, who set fire to the Reichstag, that it wasn't a Nazi operation. Now, what then happened is, of course, that Hitler seized on the Reichstag fire to introduce essentially a Nazi dictatorship into Germany. But I don't think there's ever really been any serious evidence presented that this was actually, van der Lubbe was actually working for the German government. And that, I think, is a very important distinction one always has to make, which is that there are events that take place and interested parties exploit the events for their own ends. That doesn't mean that they actually did it themselves. There are cases when they did do it themselves, but that doesn't mean that they engineered it themselves. So let's say the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor, you can certainly say the Americans were asleep at the switch. Now, was it absent-mindedness, or was this a deliberate attempt by FDR to get America into the war? And he had every intelligence information available to him of an impending Japanese attack, but he chose not to do anything about it. He chose not to make any preparations, and essentially Japan, basically a very backward country relative to the United States, got absolutely a clean hit on the U.S. Pacific Fleet on December the 7th, 1941. So that's the issue. You always have to kind of separate, the exploitation of an event, which is what the Nazis did, or the Reichstag, what FDR did at Pearl Harbor. Now, the same goes for the Tonkin Gulf incident, because although there really nothing happened there, and that it's the story was basically cooked up that there was a North Vietnamese attack on U.S. ships, the United States lied about it and used this as a pretext for launching the bombing of North Vietnam. But that didn't mean that the Americans actually staged an attack on themselves. They just lied about it and said that there was a North Vietnamese attack on the United States. But the interesting cases were, of course, in Yugoslavia during the 1990s, because there were basically three almost identical marketplace bombings in Sarajevo. There was one in 1992, one in 1994, and then one in 1995. Now, what was interesting about each of these incidents is that they happened always on the eve of some critical event. So in the case of 1992, it was on the eve of a UN Security Council debate on Yugoslavia. And then the question was going to be, is the UN going to impose sanctions on Yugoslavia? And there were a number of member states that were not, happy with imposing sanctions. They didn't really think Yugoslavia had done anything wrong. Milosevic had complied with everything that had been required of him. He had withdrawn his forces, or Yugoslavia had withdrawn its forces from Bosnia and Herzegovina. But with that bombing, there was such emotional outrage that the sanctions were imposed. And in 1994, there was on the brink, they were absolutely on the brink of signing a peace deal between Tudjman and Izetbegovic and Karadzic. It was going to be basically a kind of cantonization of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Izetbegovic, the Muslim leader, was very unhappy about this. And lo and behold, the worst of all of the Makale massacres takes place. And again, outrage, Izetbegovic walks out. And then, of course, there was one, I think Martin's talked about before, the one in 1995, which was, again, identical place. Again, immediately blamed on the Serbs. And that was the pretext that the Americans wanted to launch the bombing campaign. But what was interesting about it is that the journalists, the media, the US government and the NATO governments always blame the Serbs. Immediately say, oh yeah, the Serbs did it. The UN inspectors on the ground said, really, I don't think they did. I don't think the Serbs could have done this. I mean, they're just too far from Sarajevo to be able to make such an accurate missile attack, same place. It just couldn't be done. And there was evidence that the bombs had actually been planted there in the marketplace. But the question was, again, they immediately attributed this to the Serbs. And then going back to Ukraine, remember the key event in Ukraine, you remember there were the Maidan protests that went on month after month, the winter of 2013 and 2014. But what really set everything on edge and what really brought down Yanukovych, and then, why the Western powers said, oh, well, this is the end for Yanukovych, was these assassinations. Suddenly there were these rooftop snipers who were just shooting at people in the crowd. And then lo and behold, you said, 100 people were dead. And of course, it was immediately attributed to Yanukovych that, it was Yanukovych's forces who were the snipers on the roof. And of course, it became clear, very quickly that it was, of course, the opposition that had actually placed the snipers. The building from where the shots were coming from was controlled by the opposition. And the EU said us, we have this phone conversation where basically EU, Catherine Ashton, who was the foreign minister of the EU at the time, was told, no, we can hear that phone conversation. No, it wasn't the government forces that were responsible for these sniper attacks. Now, she just basically shrugged her shoulder. Hey, well, we've moved on from there. Who cares who did it? So that, you can see, once you create this, and then afterwards, when people want to investigate and say, yeah, I don't think this has happened the way it did, well, it's already too late. We've already moved on to the next thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's peddling that misinformation and looking at the reasons why. And the reason I say we're laboring these history points, if you like, is because it will make it more realistic that this is still happening today. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to do an even deeper dive.
I was a quarterback at Hardaway High School, college first round draft pick on and off the field. We were taught to not show any signs of weakness. During the football season, I would stop eating, but I didn't know I was depressed. I thought that something was wrong with me. For 20 plus years was physical. We didn't have any education behind what mental health was. I started to learn it starts here first. If this is together, I'll be better as a father, as a man, and as a husband. Put the importance on your mental health. I'm not scared to talk about it anymore. The first tool is therapy. The second one is positive self-talk. And then journaling, putting your thoughts on paper. We have to redefine what being a strong man is and heal, love your mind.
Around here, bushfire is just a part of life. We've been through it before, and we'll get through it again. The people here all look out for each other. We're a community that does its bit to plan and prepare, to keep everyone safe. We live with bushfire, so we live bushfire ready.
The Muckrakers are restless. This is today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, joined yet again by George Szamuely and also Martin J. And we're looking at false flags. Martin, I want to come to you.
Yeah, George's point about the Sarajevo attacks in the summer of 1995 are particularly close to my heart. I actually worked in former Yugoslavia a couple of years later in the north of Croatia. But what was surprising and what was shocking is the absolute speed that how media decides that that this particular side or that particular side did it. In this case, they blame the Serbs, and it was more or less reported as a fact. I mean, most of the journalists did not report it as perhaps the Serbs could have done this, or we suspect that this was Serbs up in the mountains. It was reported as a fact, and the absolute speed of NATO airstrikes following and the history books being rewritten and the war taking a completely different turn was breathtaking and worrying, based on the simple premise that it was all lies, it was all staged, and the worrying thing for me, after all these years of working as a journalist, is I've noticed how basically people believe what they want to believe, and depending on where they are in the world and what they've been fed so far and what they've gone along with so far. In Britain, for example, people are very, very reluctant indeed to read anything which questions their almost angelic idea of the Ukrainian government and Zelensky, this sort of messiah type figure, this victim, and you can't really go against the grain and make any other narrative against that, because people don't want it. And newspaper editors and television moguls understand this. They understand the statistics aren't in your favor when you go that way. So the Sarajevo bombing was particularly horrific. I mean, people were literally blown limb from limb. Those images were incredibly powerful. And Clinton knew that if he moved very quickly, that he would have a certain momentum and he could get those NATO airstrikes up and running, bypass the UN Security Council, just total disregard for all international law, total disregard for the truth. And I think it's unfortunately we can point the finger many times at the Americans for doing this, and American media and American institutions, or American so-called institutions which have been created since the Second World War, like the Chemicals Weapons Agency in The Hague, for example, which repeatedly over many years, when I was in Beirut, reported chemical attacks from the Assad regime on a number of towns and villages right across the north of Syria. And then years later, Andrew, I mean, literally years later, finally reported, well, actually, we got that wrong. Yeah. And it was just because of one renegade officer within the organization that wrote a report when it got leaked before it could get published. And they were basically forced to admit that all of those accusations leveled against Assad were wrong, were false. They were based on a political ideology which came from America. Wouldn't it be so useful for us to frame Assad for killing his own people with sarin or chlorine or wherever it was at the time? But now we know that they were false flag attacks. And I think there's a similar skepticism should be leveled against Israel. Israel has a history of false flag attacks. It also has a history of being quite good at refining a narrative from nowhere. It falsifies audio tapes, does this over and over again. When the Turkish flotilla aid ship, I forget the year, I think it was 2011 or 2012, came down to Gaza and was attacked by Israeli special services who boarded it. They killed a number of people on board and really badly beat up the rest, and later created falsified, completely fabricated audio tapes to justify what they'd done, of the screaming and shouting, the chaos. And it was, so the Israelis have a reputation for this, but Western media refuses to put them in that certain frame. They refuse to take a skeptical view on how the Gaza war is reported, which is really reported from the touchlines. You have all these big media who are basically on the edge of Gaza and embedded with IDF officers who every 2 or 3 hours are handing them information, via email, via printer, whatever, and then offering the journalists the help to navigate them through all the complications and the nuances of that story. But false flag attacks. A lot of it is false flag attacks, and it's getting out of control. And I think 9/11 was probably the pinnacle of how far you can go by fooling an entire nation, by when a building collapses, within days shipping out all the iron girders to another country to be melted down, and evidence to be suppressed and on a grand scale. And when years pass, what happens is that you have a narrative which CNN and others build, which is the official narrative. And then you have alternative media, which so easily gets branded as conspiracy theories. So alternative media does the real work, the real research. And I think, when we look at the conflicts that are going on now, I think there are probably more false flag attacks that are going on and will go on in the future in Ukraine. And I think we can only expect false flag attacks now from Netanyahu in the Middle East, who badly now desperately wants, in the last 6 months of the US presidency, wants to drag America into a regional war. We covered this before with the recent assassinations of the Hezbollah commanders and the Hamas chief negotiator in Iran. I think that the Iranians will not be dragged into it. I think they won't rise to the bait. They're smarter than that. But I think that gives you an indication of how desperate Netanyahu is in these last 6 months. He wants to drag Americans into it. He wants to take advantage of the fact that Kamala Harris is now running the show. And maybe she will be more easily fooled by a false flag attack on them. And the Americans are all over the place. It wouldn't be very difficult for Netanyahu to use Iranian missiles to fire one at American forces, and that would be it. You'd have that same speed of response by both militarily and by media that people will be dazzled by it. People will not even be able to stop to even ask questions, and certainly not the most fundamental questions. So false flags are a real concern.
Yeah, and I think it's so important to emphasize that we're not coming. Everybody sort of dismisses these sort of arguments as it's just a conspiracy theory and so on and so forth. The reason we've labored, if you like, the various examples in history which have been accepted by other things is to make people question everything. Say, look, it would be abhorrent if people bombed their own or attacked their own just to start a fight. Well, history suggests otherwise. It's exactly what happened. So if the circumstances are there, what we have an obligation to do as journalists is to highlight those circumstances and to say, at least ask the question. Is that a fair summary, George?
Yeah, I think it is a fair summary. And of course, if you go back to the chemical weapons attacks in Syria, I mean, we know that a great deal of pressure was being applied within the United States to get militarily involved in Syria. The public was very skeptical. The American public didn't want to get involved. So how do you get the public to move? Well, you can certainly do it by way of launching an attack against American forces or Americans, or you can create a humanitarian disaster that can say, well, you see the sort of savages we're dealing with, you see these animals that we have. So in 2013, when this was after Obama had said, "Oh, this is a red line. If Assad uses chemical weapons, that's a red line," which of course was entirely a signal. Great, well, let's have a chemical weapons attack to get America involved. And just as the weapons inspectors were in Syria, there was the huge Ghouta attack, and of course, it was immediately attributed to Assad. No one even wondering, well, why would Assad launch such an attack just as the UN inspectors were in the country? And I mean, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. Then such questions were immediately dismissed. Well, Assad is just such a horrific monster. He so wants to humiliate the world. He wants to humiliate the United States. He wants to humiliate the United Nations, that he did it, staged it right in front of them. And I think Obama was all set to go. He was all set to start bombing Syria, until he was told by his own intelligence, says, well, I think this chemical weapons attack was done by the opposition. They were the ones who launched this attack. That wouldn't necessarily have stopped Obama, but what did stop Obama was that the British were also briefed on this. And then the British, they found out about this, and then there was a vote in Parliament, and the vote in Parliament went against getting involved in Syria. And that once the British pulled out, and Obama was kind of left, all alone. Then he said, "Okay, well, and the Russians saved him by cobbling together that disarmament deal on Syria." But Israel does have a long history of staging false flag attacks in order to justify its actions. So remember, the invasion of Lebanon in 1982 followed a kind of a fake assassination of the Israeli ambassador in London. He wasn't actually assassinated, but and then Israel got very indignant. Oh, the PLO was murdering our people, and used that as a pretext to invade Lebanon. And later on, we found out, well, no, it wasn't the PLO, it was Abu Nidal. But Abu Nidal was essentially an Israeli agent. So even if it was Abu Nidal organization that was behind the attempted assassination of the Israeli ambassador, it's still Israel. And of course, with other things in the past was the Lavon affair in the 1950s, where in Egypt there were repeated attacks on American and British targets in Egypt, which were of course blamed on the Egyptian government and the communist allies. And of course, it was fake. I mean, the idea was to cause a rift between NASA and the West. And, eventually it happened with the British invasion of Suez a couple of years later. But you could see that was the Israeli modus operandi. We need to get everybody against NASA, so we'll stage attacks on British and Americans and say, oh, that was NASA. And of course, there was the famous case of the USS Liberty. Now, Israel said, well, we made a mistake. You just made a boo-boo. We attacked the U.S. spy ship. Everybody could see it was a U.S. ship. What was behind it? Well, it was basically Israel wanted the United States to get involved in that war. So, hey, it wasn't us. It was the Egyptians who did it. So there's a long history of these attacks. Always the same view: get other people involved in your war.
Absolutely. And as I say, that's absolutely the mission here on the Muckrakers, is to shine a spotlight on this, to say, look, it's not pie in the sky. These things have happened. History has been polluted with these examples of false flags, so that next time you see something, do question everything. Martin J, Dr. George Szamuely, always a pleasure. I'll see you again on Monday. For the rest of you, have a great weekend. We'll see you next time.
Very.
To hear a replay of this hour, go to episodes at tntradio.live. Now, TNT Radio News.
With your hourly news brief, I'm Matt Boyland. Just days after assassinating Hezbollah's commander in Lebanon, Israel says it's ready for a wider war in the Middle East. The Israeli Defence Force confident Israel's allies would join the fight, as it declared the Iranian-backed group a global threat that must be dealt with.
Hezbollah is a global terror organization that poses a global threat. Their ongoing aggression and attacks are dragging the region into a wider escalation. As we have said many times, while we prefer to resolve hostilities without a wider war, we remain fully prepared for any scenario. We know how to defend ourselves. We have strong offensive capabilities